All right, even though some people are still entering, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'd like to be on time and end on time to the extent that we can. Hi, everybody. My name is Sebastian Faber. I'm the chair of the Board of Governors of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, a New York City-based educational nonprofit. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to see so many of you here for this very special program. It's a real honor and privilege to have three great scholars with us today to talk a little bit about the experience of Black volunteers in the Spanish Civil War who fought to defend the Spanish Republic. The main idea of this event, which we celebrate in the honor of Black History Month, is to try to zoom out a bit and to think about the experience of Black volunteers in Spain in a broader time frame and a broader geographic space. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists today, and I'm going to hand it over to them to share with us some of the key points of their research. So we're really honored to have Janelle Hope and Bill Mullen here. Janelle is Director and Associate Professor of African American Studies at Prairie View A&M University, and Bill Mullen is Professor of American Studies at Purdue. They are the authors of a forthcoming book, come out in early April with Haymarket, called The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, Fighting Back from Anti-Lynching to Abolition, which shows how generations of Black activists and intellectuals, from Ida B. Wells in the fight against lynching to Angela Davis in the fight against the prison industrial complex, have stood within a tradition of Black anti-fascism. Janelle is a native of Oakland, California, and a scholar activist who's formerly been engaged in organizing with Socialist Alternative, Black Lives Matter, Sacramento, and various other campus groups. And she's a current member of the DSA. Bill is a longtime activist and organizer and co-founder of the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. Ariel May Lamb is Associate Professor of History at UConn, the author of a great book called No Barrier Can Contain It, Cuban Anti-Fascism and the Spanish Civil War, which came out right before COVID. Ariel May Lamb, like I said, is the author of No Barrier Can Contain It, Cuban Anti-Fascism and the Spanish Civil War, which tells the story of diverse Cuban anti-fascists during the interwar period, some of them volunteers in the Spanish Civil War, from a transnational perspective. Cuban anti-fascist funds, goods, and ideas crossed borders and oceans with Cuban anti-fascists as they sought to defeat fascism in multiple forms, build a new Cuba, and bring diverse visions of a better world to fruition. Anna Dunsing is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. She researches the entangled legacies of fascism and anti-fascism as they played out on the battlefield of the Black freedom struggle from the 40s to the 1980s, focusing on the intersecting transnational stories of activists, soldiers, artists, and intellectuals who after 1945 continued to find in fascism a powerful framework for critiquing white supremacy and racialized state violence. Her book in progress is called Fascism is Already Here, Civil Rights and the Making of a Black Anti-Fascist Tradition. She's also a founding member and board member of the anti-fascist educational collective called the April Institute, theaprilinstitute.org, and hosts the podcast, What It Is and How to Fight It. So I'm really pleased to have everybody here. And I'll go ahead right away and hand it over to Bill and Janelle to talk a little bit about the book that they finished and that's going to be out in a little over a month. Take it away, Bill and Janelle.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited to be here with you all. I'd first like to start by thanking Mark, Sebastian, Dennis, and everyone on staff with staff and volunteering to help support the Abraham Lincoln Brigade's archives. I am truly impressed to be here for Black History Month with 134 folks in the Zoom space. I take excited or at least interested to be here and take part in this discussion on Black anti-fascism, particularly on the Spanish Civil War. So I've been kind of tasked with giving some broad strokes for our discussion today, and some of the other panelists will delve a little bit deeper, but I'm going to set up a little bit of framing for our discussion today. As was mentioned, Bill and I have a forthcoming book that'll be out in April, The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, Fighting Back from Anti-Lynching to Abolition. Our work is two-pronged. First, we take up Amy Cesaire's argument that the root of European fascism lay in the daily barbarisms practiced on Black life in the colonies. Thus, the authoritarian, genocidal, exploitative, and anti-democratic, as well as sexist practices of colonialism stand as some of the earliest seeds of fascism. And our book argues that the Black experience has been one animated by what we call anti-Black fascism. Overall, the book seeks to move analyses of fascism beyond 20th century Europe and understand fascism's colonial and American roots. In doing so, we build upon John Whitman's work by taking up US slave codes, Jim Crow laws, and immigration laws, and look at how they have served as the blueprint for the Nuremberg laws and Italian race laws and other sort of laws that predicated or legalized, right, codified fascism in Europe. Beyond the law, we also look across space and time and detail how the Black experience has been one shaped by deep-seated elements of fascism, from dual application of the law, authoritarian and anti-democratic policies, systematic genocide and ethnic cleansing, militarism and state-sanctioned violence, control of reproductive rights. We have several chapters detailing this tradition of anti-Black fascism and Black immiseration from the anti-lynching movement, Black Power era, to the current movement calling for abolition. On the flip side, or conversely, the book also seeks to uplift an entire tradition of Black anti-fascists that have long been under-discussed within history. We start our book with Ida B. Wells and giving her another crown. In addition to being the mother of the anti-lynching movement, we call her a premature Black anti-fascist in her pioneering work to document the histories of lynchings, to sound the proverbial alarm on what was happening across the South in terms of the rigging of the courts and the entire justice system in the process of trying to seek justice for lynchings, right? We shift to folks like W.E.B. Du Bois, who also picks up Wells Barnett's work in continuing to work on the anti-lynching campaign under the NAACP, but also his writings that speak to anti-colonial and Pan-Africanist themes. We turn to someone who is very significant to ALBA, being Harry Haywood, in his volunteer service during the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. And I'll talk a little bit about Haywood a little bit later. We turn to the poetry of Langston Hughes, who during the World War II period was an ardent anti-fascist and wrote several poems and pieces that spoke out about the ills of fascism in Europe as well as the ills of fascism at home. That is echoed in the work of Paul Robeson. We take up the legal history of William Patterson, who pioneeringly leads a effort to charge the United States with genocide, putting together a petition in 1951 that submitted to the United Nations. We turn to Robert F. Williams, one of the architects of self-defense during the Black Power era, and how he actually was in Cuba writing about fascism in America and fascism abroad, and how Black folks should engage in self-defense to combat such. We turn to Angela Davis in our latter chapters and her push for prison abolition and seeing how prisons are inextricably linked to anti-Black fascism. And we also turn to the more anarchist writings of Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Army. These activists, intellectuals, anarchists, and artists all name fascism as the key oppressive feature of Black life in the United States. Throughout the book, we detail how these folks turn to the law and lobbying in the international bodies such as the UN. They also leverage the press, community organizing, anarchy, mutual aid, art, and more to challenge anti-Black fascism head on. Moreover, what's a central part of the book, and why we're here today, is we trace how the fight against fascism in Europe and Africa were also major rallying points for Black Americans during World War I and World War II. For example, Harry Haywood, an Abraham Lincoln Brigade veteran, would call the 1919 Chicago riot a Holocaust, drawing parallels between European fascism, which he was on the front lines fighting, and the experiences of Black Chicagoans. Even the Double V campaign that the Pittsburgh Courier came up with was about defeating fascism abroad and at home. Black Americans were ardent fighters during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, and World War II. And so this gives us a little bit of framing of how Bill and I sort of approach looking at Black anti-fascism in this sort of historical way. I want to pivot and turn to Bill, who's going to better elucidate the specific history around Black folks' engagement in the Spanish Civil War, give you all a deeper dive into Harry Haywood, as well as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade veterans and volunteers that we talk about in the book. And also give a little bit of a thanks to the organizers for even creating this digital repository that we can draw upon for this book. So take it away, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Janelle, and thank you all for coming out. It's exciting to have this chance to talk about this. Yeah, the Spanish Civil War folks are definitely in our book, and we could never replicate like the brilliant documentation that's already been done at large by Alba and other folks. But people like Haywood play a key role in our book, not just as a Spanish Civil War volunteer, but also as a signatory to the We Charge Genocide petition of 1951 that comes before the United Nations. And that kind of continuity is really important to us because we see Spain as both a culmination and a prequel. And what I mean by that is by the middle of the 1930s, many of the people, Black Americans that are going to decide to go to Spain, people like James Yates, for example, and Thyra Edwards, some of you may know, was an amazing woman who came up from Houston to Chicago and went to Spain in the late 30s, had really been trained by Ethiopia. And we really talk a lot about the Ethiopia anti-fascist campaign in Black communities as predictive of the next phase of struggle. I mean, it's worth remembering that most folks couldn't actually get to Ethiopia to fight. There was a huge desire among Black Americans, for example, after 1935, to somehow get involved in the campaign. Thyra Edwards, because she can't go there, ends up doing work in the United States to raise funds to send to Ethiopia, and in the late 1930s gets involved in a campaign to raise funds for ambulances for Spain. And the continuity is really important for us because we argue that Ethiopia actually may have created the first global anti-fascist movement, certainly involving Black folks. We look at CLR James and George Padmore, who are centered in London, working on International Friends of Ethiopia. We look at the Hands Off Ethiopia movement that erupts in Harlem in 1935. In effect, this was the training ground, I think, for the kind of politics that Black Americans then, understood very explicitly when the Spanish Civil War erupts, and of course they can actually travel there. Yates's book From Mississippi to Madrid is one of the best accounts, I think, of the Black Spanish Civil War volunteers. But I mean, pulling back the lens even a little bit further, we in the introduction we talk about the importance of two kind of foundational Black anti-fascist texts. One is Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire, which Janelle has mentioned, and the other is the We Charge Genocide petition. They come out 1 year apart from each other, 1950 and 1951. They are post-war reflections on the meaning of fascism by people in the Black diaspora. And they draw essentially the same conclusion, which is that the root, R-O-O-T, of what has become fascism in the 20th century passes through Africa and the Caribbean and the slave trade and colonialism. And that's why Ethiopia becomes in some ways the first flashpoint or illuminating point for this phenomenon. Spain illuminates this phenomenon in a slightly different way. Langston Hughes goes to Spain because he's around the CP and he understands that's what he's supposed to be doing. But he goes there because he wants to see what the Moorish experience is of the war. He goes there to see the Moors who are being conscripted to fight by the Spanish from their North African protectorates or colonies, and is terribly interested to see what does it mean for the Moor and the Black American like to find each other in the Spanish Civil War. And for Hughes, the Spanish Civil War and Spain's role in the history of the slave trade and colonialism is a really complicated framing
for the fight for the Spanish future. And he writes a really brilliant poem in which he really argues that if the Moor and the African American cannot find each other on some free ground in Spain, then we have really no chance of overthrowing, not just winning this war, but of overthrowing the larger colonial system. And I think that's really an important point for us too, which was that the Spanish Civil War and the campaign for Ethiopia, which germinated Black anti-fascism, really carried through the 1940s and 1950s and became a precursive of the anti-colonial movement that kind of by 1960 results in most of the African countries going free. I'll say one couple more things about the We Charge Genocide linked to the Spanish Civil War. Haywood was a signatory to the We Charge Genocide petition, and the petition's fundamental claim was that the history of violence against Black folks in the United States, including lynchings, police shootings, extra legal attacks, was a kind of Native American fascism. And in 1951, their appeal to the United Nations was to use the new Genocide 1948 Convention and apply it retroactively to American history. It was also an attempt to have international law trump what they felt was an irrevocably racist set of laws that had enabled Jim Crow, slavery, even the segregated, military in the 1940s, which black soldiers were forced to fight in. So Haywood's continuity with that document is really important, but so is somebody like Claudia Jones, right? Claudia comes around the CP in the 1930s. She doesn't go to Spain, but she joins the CP, and she does it because the CP is articulating the best politics on fascism. And in particular, she's very impressed with the fact that the CP is standing up for Ethiopia. She's a signatory to We Charge Genocide. And many of you know that many of the Spanish Civil War veterans, when they come home, are persecuted ruthlessly, right? I mean, they end up being called before HUAC, both because of their sometimes CP affiliation, but also because the state is actually identifying anti-fascism as a political problem that has to be squashed, right, during the Cold War, partly because documents like We Charge Genocide are implicitly accusing the US of being a fascist state in 1951. So when Jones is deported in 1955 to England, one of her final comments is, the United States is deporting anti-fascists and defending fascists. And what she means by that is in 1955, when she's deported, the US still has very friendly relationships with Franco. Nothing has changed, right, in a certain way there. The last thing I'll say vis-a-vis the Spanish Civil War and I think the 1940s connection and up to the future. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was a CP organization in the South, one of its volunteers as a young woman was Sally Bell Davis, the mother of Angela Davis. And she learned her anti-fascist politics in the 1940s from people like Esther Cooper, who were writing manifestos for the SNYC in the 1940s. Angela Davis is a crucial figure for us in the Black anti-fascist tradition. And if you look carefully at her book that she wrote with Bettina Epstecker called If They Come For Us in the Morning, which she writes from the Marin County Jail in 1970, after the state is trying to essentially execute her for her completely undocumented role in the Jonathan Jackson Marin County escape. The book theorizes fascism in late 1960s, early 1970s in America as what she calls preventive counter-revolution. And this is an idea that goes back in some ways to earlier sort of CP ways of thinking about fascism as anti-revolutionary in the German and Italian context. But in 1970, it means it's an attempt to put down the Black liberation struggle. And it's a provocative idea. It's also heavily influenced by her work with Herbert Marcuse, who is at the same time developing this idea of preventive counter-revolution. Angela Davis kind of gives it a face and a name because she's literally in the Black liberation struggle. So I'm trying to establish some of these continuities that we talk about in the book to argue really that this is a very self-reflexive tradition of Black radicals and intellectuals looking backward and forward at the Black experience and relationship to fascism, but also oftentimes developing unique theoretical interpretations of what it means and how to combat it. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Bill. Janelle, that you had everything, you said everything you wanted to say for now, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's move over to Ariel Lamb, who has studied Cuba and anti-fascism. Take it away, Ariel.
So much. I'm going to try to share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. So I am so excited to read this book that Janelle and Bill are describing. I am just thrilled to hear about it and really excited to dig in. So my name is Ariel Lamb. I am a history professor at the University of Connecticut, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Black Cuban anti-fascism, which you will quickly hear has a lot of overlap. Why is it not moving? There we go. Okay, so the reason that I'm here is because of an effort that Sebastian and some colleagues made long ago to identify the man in the middle of this oval photo here, who is holding up a banner that reads in part, Centuria Antonio Guiteras, which was known in English as the Cuban section of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. He was known by his friends as Cuba Hermosa, which means beautiful Cuba. And his picture was gifted by the Spanish government to Barack Obama after Obama was elected president in celebration of African-American volunteers. And Sebastian and colleagues looked into his identity to try to notify his family of the honor. And in that process, discovered that he was not, in fact, African-American, he was Cuban. And so they did a lot of really great historical research in the archives there, found some photographs, found a memoir of a man named John Tisa, who talked about Cuba Hermosa. And just so happened that right around that time, I was beginning work on my dissertation that would eventually become my book. And so I took a little piece of paper with the names that they found for this individual and the photos that they had. And I carried them around with me to Havana and to Madrid and Albacete and other areas where I traveled for my dissertation research. And eventually I came back to this photo on the other side here, which I believed was a match. And I wrote an article for Sebastian and the group for the volunteer on this individual and what his identity and the search for his identity more so meant about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archive and our collective interest in this history, what it takes to find somebody who was at least partially obscuring his identity, right, using a pseudonym. If you care to read the article, I put the citation there at the bottom. You can see a set of pictures that I took that gets me from the one in the oval to the one in the rectangle, and shows my assessment that it's the same person, and talks a little bit about how I then found him in Havana in the archives there and tried to figure out his life. This is my book. I put up the table of contents just so that you can see that this work that I'm talking about today fits into a much larger whole. Much like the book that Janelle and Bill are talking about, I am pulling one piece of my research out for today, but it's part of a much bigger trajectory and range of topics. So in the book, I'll talk in a moment about the importance of Ethiopia. There's an entire chapter in the book about Ethiopia. It talks about the Communist Party in Cuba supporting it, but mostly it talks about Black Cuban support and what that meant. Then there's another section later on in the book where I talk about volunteers in particular. So Cuban anti-fascism had two overarching goals that many different anti-fascists, from Freemasons to anarchists, liberal Christians, all sorts of different people, indicated in the terms New Cuba and New Spain. Cuba, as you might know, was a Spanish colony. It was part of Spain until 1898. So in the 1930s, it was very recently a literal colony of Spain. And it was under the oppression at the time in the 30s of what they called neo-colonialism, that is the United States' oppression and influence over the island. So it was both post-colonial and neo-colonial. And the idea of a new Cuba was a Cuba free of any form of colonialism or imperialism and free of strongman rule. Right? So it didn't necessarily mean democracy, because remember, we've got anarchists in the mix. So not everybody is saying they want a democracy, but everybody is saying they don't want any kind of dictatorship or strongman rule. Okay, so that's what they meant by New Cuba. But what did they mean by New Spain? Well, they meant not the Spain that colonized them. If any of you are familiar with Cuban history, you know that they fought for 30 years, 30 years in 3 different wars against Spanish colonialism. They did not want to have anything to do with that Spain. And yet here we had 1,000 Cubans who traveled to Spain to fight for the Republic. So what they saw as a new Spain was not the Spain that had colonized them, but a new vision of a new Spain going forward with which they had every solidarity. So that's an interesting paradox of Cuban anti-fascism and the Spanish Civil War, is they had just gotten done fighting Spain, basically, and here they were fighting for Spain. So that was an interesting thought experiment and an important political and philosophical problem that they had to wrap their heads around. I find this image very interesting. This was by an illustrator, a very famous illustrator of the 30s in Cuba, who went by Hercar. He was a Black man, and he did a lot of political cartoons. This image, I think, is interesting in the sense that it looks at fascism as represented by the images of the European and Japanese leaders of sort of what we would call pure fascism or actual fascism, and then the neo-colonial arm on the side of the United States. And they're literally trying to rip the island in half, right? They're literally trying to tear the island in two. And so that really shows the tension in the sense that it's neo-colonialism and it's fascism, and they're all bad for Cuba, right? So like Janelle and Bill were saying, Black fascism in Cuba, just like elsewhere, really begins with Ethiopia. In the case of Cuba, and this very much overlaps everything that Janelle and Bill were saying, Cuban nationalism is anti-imperialist and anti-strongman rule. In the case of Cuba, I would argue slightly different national context than for African Americans. You know, many Cubans recognized actual, like, colonialism in the sense of colonial rule over their island from a foreign power fully in charge of their government, right? They had had that experience with Spain, and then they had that experience with the United States, which controlled the Cuban government with a document called the Platt Amendment in the Cuban Constitution. All the way until just before the Spanish Civil War, just before the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. So there was a sense in which colonialism was perhaps even more present for Black Cubans than necessarily for African Americans, although that's absolutely something that we can discuss if that doesn't sit right. It was also a movement of the African diaspora, of course, and with some degree of overlap with leftist internationalism. So not all Black Cubans were leftists, but as I think everybody who's here who has any kind of understanding of this history, there was a lot of overlap. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge whoever is getting rid of all the graffiti. Kudos to you. You're doing an amazing job. Keep up the good work. We're fighting the good fight here. Okay, so just a couple of individual volunteers that I want to talk about very briefly. This is Jose G. Brindon, who was celebrated in the Black anti-fascist magazine in Cuba, which was called Adelante, as a as somebody who had achieved an officership in the Spanish Republican Army. All right, so this is not somebody who was in the international brigades. And this is an important point for the Cubans. Of course, they spoke Spanish fluently. They had a great deal of Spanish culture as part of their own culture. So they were able to integrate into the Republican Army in a way that most US Americans, most Anglo Americans could not. Most Anglo Americans were not perfectly fluent in Spanish. They didn't share that. Did I just lose my screen sharing? Maybe I did.
Yeah. Ariel, if you could just continue. Sorry about the
Sure.
interruption
Yeah.
there.
No, you're fine. No problem. So this is an important difference from our Anglo-American volunteers, that men like Brindon were able to enter into the Spanish Republican Army directly,
I don't know.
and were able to attain the rank of an officer. I was not able to, in this case, the magazine called him comandante. I was not able to verify specifically what rank he achieved, because that could correspond to a couple of different ranks, but he was an officer, and that was something that Adelante celebrated. They very briefly, there was a tradition in among Cuban African American, Black Cubans, that was similar, for example, to W.E.B. Du Bois's famous Paris exhibit, right? Where there was a tradition of Black Cubans celebrating images, photographic images of what would be considered very high culture, high formal education, military excellence, etc. So we can see in this image Adelante presenting a, I'm sorry, can you all still see my slides? They keep going in and out for me.
Ariel, if we could just continue without the slides for a little bit.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I've lost the, okay. Anyway, we'll move on. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the second of the two volunteers whom I had pulled out of a group of many, was Basilio Cueria, who is familiar to Alba folks. I think he is, I would say, arguably, if we don't count Cuba Hermosa, Basilio Cueria is the most famous of the Black Cuban Abraham Lincoln Brigade volunteers. He was a celebrated baseball player in both Cuba and Harlem, and was made famous by his bravery and his skill in battle, but also by two articles, one in Cuba and one in New York, by close intellectual comrades and friends, Nicolas Guillen, the famous biracial Cuban poet and essayist, and Langston Hughes. The two of them knew each other. They were in Spain together at the same time. I have a great picture of that, along with Ernest Hemingway. They each wrote a brief summary of Cueria's life and exploits in Spain. And I can speak, I've run over my time, so I'm going to stop, but I can speak more to the way in which Hughes and Guillen interpreted Cueria differently based on the Black Cuban perspective versus the African American perspective, and also some of the ways in which they overlapped in really interesting ways that I think draws my work together with the work of the other panelists. So forgive me, I got a little thrown off there. I think I went over my time, but thank you all for your attention, and I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Ariel. It's so apologies. You're such a trooper, just plowing straight through. It's super interesting, and I hope people pick up your book because it's really fascinating with the work that you've done. Anna, over to you.
Thank you all so much for being here, and I really think it's worth saying again, just to offer some gratitude to the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archive. You know, in addition to programming like this, just the archive itself, as well as the resources for educators in particular, is something I turn to all the time. So I think it's really important to recognize that. And I'm gonna kind of take us to slightly big picture and root us slightly more back in the US context and kind of wrap up this initial opening conversation by focusing on what we might think of as kind of the Black American legacy of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and a bit about my work. My work is very much in conversation with Bill and Janelle's book, which I'm so excited to have it out in the world very soon. But my work is thinking about the place of anti-fascism within the larger Black radical tradition, and in particular, interested in joining this growing group of interdisciplinary scholars who are interested in looking at anti-fascist politics within Black radical organizing as a long, coherent politics across the 20th century, right? Rather than something that sort of just discretely happened in the 30s and then sort of showed up again in the 60s. So the questions that guide my work, which also I'm very fortunate right now to be teaching a lot of these themes. So it's, I think teaching is such a great way to think through ideas. The questions I've been thinking about a lot lately, and specifically regarding this conversation, is a big one, but what does anti-fascism look like? And then in turn, what does solidarity look like? And what can we understand maybe as particular about Black anti-fascist thought and activism? And another thing I want to set up just in establishing this conversation, again, sometimes in teaching, you really get to go back to the basics in a really tremendous way. And I think just to recognize the special significance of the moment of the Spanish Civil War and of the moment of the international brigades, right? That this remains one of the only times in history, right, where a global volunteer force left where they came from and went to defend democracy in a distant land, right? And recognizing, I was looking at some of the conversations in the chat, right? They came from over 50 countries. They spoke many languages, and they did have, many affiliated with respective communist parties, but they had many more and much more complex and diverse political and ideological backgrounds and positions, but just recognizing the diversity and the breadth, and what they ultimately had in common was a both an individual and a collective politics of anti-fascism, they all understood in some respect that they were on the right side of history. And of the 2,800 or so American volunteers, we know that about 90 of them were Black volunteers. And so I think, right, recognizing, at a certain scale, that's a small number, but their stories are so significant. They really are. And I want to name some of the reasons why I think that's the case. One, the legacy of the Black volunteers is one that emphasizes the ways Black activists, both, and I think at a leadership level, but far more so at the grassroots, serve as the vanguard in forging democracy, and vanguards of liberation, vanguards of more just futures. And I think in particular, I've spent some time in prepping for this conversation, looking at some of the biographies of the Black volunteers coming from the US, and that means memoirs, oral histories, or just the wonderful documents that the archive has been able to put together. And if you look, there's really three things they tend to name as why they went. And sometimes it's cumulative, sometimes it's specific. But one is an upbringing in the Jim Crow South, right? That James Yates famously calls his book From Mississippi to Madrid. And he, like many, Black Americans of his time, right, name an upbringing in a context like that as why fascism wasn't surprising to them in any respect, right, when it sort of shows up en masse in this global moment of the 1930s. So first, right, we have an origin in the, social, legal, totalitarian regime that is Jim Crow. Two, more generally, you have the moment of the Great Depression, right? Which speaks to, I think, an extension in some respects of the Jim Crow South, right? This moment of life under a racially hierarchical political economy based on exploitive labor relationships, right? That Yates, for instance, also names, right? A moment being on a hunger march, the sort of the policeman's boot and baton as being what makes him understand what fascism is again. And then I think as my other panelists have indicated, Hands Off Ethiopia is the other turning point moment. So to draw out these themes, right, pointing to origins in the Jim Crow South, pointing to Mississippi, Alabama, what have you, right, speaks to a theme that I'm very interested in studying Black anti-fascist thought and activism, and Bill and Janelle have nodded to this, right, is an attention to, right, what Ida B. Wells was interested in, the moment of the 19th century, post-Civil War US South, the moment when the country sort of scrambles to rebuild an economic system based on racial hierarchy and exploitation. I think that's an exciting time to sort of, I know there's been some discussion and debate about the origins of the term Abraham Lincoln Brigade, right? But I think it's an exciting moment to seize upon Black radical reinterpretations of the Civil War and Reconstruction period. And link their discussions of fascism in the 30s to that post-Civil War moment in trying to understand and name that post-Civil War moment as a white ruling class response to the revolutionary insurgency of working people, especially Black working people, right? And then naming the kind of reactionary authoritarian system that's established to suppress that radical vision, right? Which could be seen as culminating in a moment in that late 20s, early 30s moment. So I think that's linking those two, linking the origins in the Jim Crow South to a kind of the crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, the violent policing and strike breaking that many of these volunteers would have been direct witnesses and victims to is so key. And then regarding the, I think by a focus on Black volunteers really, I think, asks that we don't really talk about Spain without also talking about Ethiopia. We understand how much those two moments and encounters with fascism and anti-fascist resistance should be understood as wholly intertwined as turning points, right? One, because as was the case with the massive global Black-led movement that arose in response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, it was a lesson about fascism's relationship to imperialism and racism, right? It was an invitation to talk about fascism beyond a cluster of regimes in interwar Europe, right? To sort of push beyond the chronological, but also the geographic bounds of interwar Europe and talking about and thinking about what fascism is and where it must be confronted, and understanding where it came from and where it might be going. And then I think also really key, I just a couple of weeks ago, I taught the speech that Emperor Haile Selassie gives before the League of Nations. And I think in both cases, it's a really important moment to follow what the volunteers would have done, which was name a critique of neutrality and name a critique of an unwillingness from above to intervene in the clear face of enduring human rights violations, right, and war crimes, even when there were international structures in place to do so. And I think that's another great moment you see, and looking at those two historical moments so close beside one another as intertwined. And then just to close my comments for now, I think it's also really important in centering Black volunteers to attend to what happens to them when they get back, if they get back, right? One, that many of them are forced to then fight in segregated units again, right? And I think, so we can also then see the wonderful research that we have about Black soldiers and Black war workers during World War II. We can sort of read that history forward in a similar way. So that's one important legacy we get. Two is to look at the blacklisting that these men endured, look at the surveillance, the repression, the ways that, for sometimes years and years, they struggled to make lives, to find work. And that's a really good way to think about, many scholars have written about this, but most recently, the scholar Charisse Burden-Stelly describes this as sort of the Black Scare, Red Scare, understanding the ways that a linking of anti-communism and sort of anti-radical repression more generally in the United States is typically bound up with anti-Black repression. And especially, right, when we're reading that history forward, looking at where the US then aligns both domestically and in terms of foreign relations, not just to really read into what a close, affectionate relationship with the Franco regime and the post-war moment meant, right? Not just allyship in broad terms, but over $1 billion into the Spanish economy in exchange for largely for military bases, right? So then by contrast, to end on a more positive note, I think to look forward to the positive legacy of the volunteers in question, right? That how many of them, despite all of that, despite all that they faced, that many of them went on to have really robust lives as organizers and volunteers in the civil rights movement, in anti-nuclear organizing and radical pacifism, right? That their struggle did not end in Spain. And to see, right, this moment as part of a longer moment of radical organizing, of anti-fascism, always being bound up with anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-poverty, right, anti-capitalism, and that each one of these men, I mean, again, just to kind of end with honoring again the work of the archive, allows us to see and emphasize and celebrate these specific moments, but also understand, right, that the history and the legacy of what that moment meant, you can follow it any number of ways across the rest of the 20th century. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Janelle and Bill, for keeping so good to your time. I know all of these topics are really super interesting and fascinating, and it's difficult to limit them to 10 or 15 minutes. But I'm super pleased that we have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. So please post your questions to the chat, and then our indefatigable executive assistant Dennis Meany will do some culling and some curating of those questions for you all. I just want to say this that what you just talked about, the four of you, is really what I hoped this event would do was like pull out, like zoom out, and give us the bigger context for Black experience in Spain, and it really has. And it's fascinating to me how what it does, it puts the US back into world history in a way. And it allows us to see how experiences in the territory of the United States were resonant with and resonated later on in so many other spaces, and how that really changes our view, the narrative of US history, which is one of the things that we're trying to do in our institutes with high school teachers, right, to sort of like reframe how US history is told. And we know how important that is just by the sheer resistance that we're facing in all these legislative initiatives at the state level, where the Republican Party in particular is trying to control how US history is being taught, right? So we know how powerful it is because it's causing a lot of resistance, and people are afraid of divisive topics these days. So, Dennis, do you have some questions for some of the
Sure. Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you everybody for your patience and professionalism on this. Okay, I think we can go to kind of friend of Alba. One, Charlie Christ has a little question about Harry Haywood. If you'd like to, Charlie, if you'd like to ask that question now, you could do so.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Seriously, it was great being able to hear about all your books. I was like writing down so many of them. So I interned at Alba a little while back working on the archives, but I'm actually a grad student at BC, and I'm kind of studying the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and the American Medical Bureau veterans that went to Mexico, and especially like the Black radical tradition of like sojourning. Like I'm looking at the poetry of like Ray Durham, Harry Haywood, things like that. And I was just wondering if you guys had any experience. I'm kind of looking for like more angles on that because the movement seems to be very fluid. Like they talked about moving back and forth between Cuba and Mexico. And I was just wondering, especially thinking about Cuba as well, because like the Ray Durham, the poet, I'm kind of looking into specifically, he was trying to get there. Robert Williams is there. And again, I mostly just want to thank you so much, especially for putting up with all the nonsense. And I'm really looking forward to reading all of your books in your new book. And yeah, just thanks again.
Bill, go ahead.
I'll just say something about Mexico and Thyra Edwards. If you're done any work on Thyra Edwards, she goes to Germany in 1934. She goes to Spain around 38. She comes back to the US, and then she ends up in Mexico resettling refugees from Spain and writes about it at the Chicago, her papers, part of her papers are at the Chicago Public Library. And I didn't know anything about that piece of her life and work. She writes several articles about her experience. She's also she's working with children mainly in these resettlement communities and writing for the Black press about it. She writes some articles for Crisis. She's in my opinion, still a very understudied figure in this period. Also, if I could just say, it was very tight with Celeria Key. I saw a question come up. She was a nurse in Harlem. Some of you may know, went to Spain, worked as a nurse there. They were so close before they went to Spain. They were doing the ambulance fundraising. But Celeria's autobiography, some folks think, was written by Thyra. I'm not sure about that. It's something to check out. But that's just add that to your question. I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah, thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you, Bill. Next question, Dennis.
Oh, does anybody, I don't know. If
Oh,
anybody else wanted-
if somebody wanted to add, Ariel, you have something to add? But
Oh, sure, Charlie, just nice to Zoom meet you. And your work sounds fascinating. If you have questions about Cubans whom you encounter in your search, or other folks who were going to Cuba, please feel free to get in touch with me. I have lots and lots and lots of material on Cubans that didn't make it into my book. So if you run into them, please just be in touch. I'm ariel.lam@uconn.edu. Feel free to be in touch. Okay.
Thank you, Charlie, and everybody. Thank you for the answer to that question. We have another question from Dario Fernandez Graziano. We've spoken before. If you'd like to ask your question, you can do so now.
Yeah, so I'm a master's student right now, and I'm doing research on one of the volunteers for my thesis, Von Love. And I wanted to ask, like, what advice or suggestions would you give to pursue like an academic career, getting into a PhD, publishing eventually, etc. in the field? Because I want to do a PhD in the future, and I'm just looking for advice and suggestions on that.
that's a bit of a general question, Dario, but feel free to email me if you want to, Sebastian.Faber@urban.edu, and I'm happy to give you some advice.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to reaching directly out to Sebastian, I think you're entering the field in a really good time. As you see here on the panel, there are scholars doing some really amazing work right now in studying fascism. And so, as well as Black internationalism, there's been some really good, actually, special issues of journals that have really taken up Black internationalism of the past couple of years. So I think you'd be entering at a really good time, and being able to find, hopefully, a mentor at an institution that would be able to support this kind of research, given that it is such a generative topic right now. So I wish you luck. I think the topic will be of interest, hopefully, to many, and folks will see the value in it. But certainly reach out to Sebastian. You can also reach out to me. I'm at jkhope@pvamu.edu. Happy to talk about grad school. I kind of do this advising and mentoring for my students. So
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you for those good answers. I think we did. Just go back. I believe maybe some people in the chat have have begun answering this question, but there's a question about Celeria Key. Maybe we can put that to the panel as well. Loretta Hellier, if you'd like to ask your question, you can do so now.
Yeah, so I'm currently doing an undergrad dissertation on Celeria Key and Thyra Edwards as well. And I was just wondering about if you could speak to the to Celeria's involvement in anti-fascism within the Spanish Civil War, and if this was a key component of her contribution, or whether she focused more on her nursing and that side within the war. Thank you. And thank you for all the presentations.
I'll jump in just because I got excited and responded in the chat first. I mean, I think something I think a lot about, both in my research and in my activism, is sort of like at what point does someone become an anti-fascist, versus being an anti-racist, or just sort of a radical activist, people understand their own political identities and their own organizing identities and just their own identities in the world in certain ways, and at what moment. Right. And sometimes it's when they encounter a fascist, right? I'm speaking to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, and that was the reign of many of the activists here in response to the Unite the Right rally in 2017, was sort of I didn't ever think of myself as an anti-fascist, but then I realized my work in housing justice, my work in organizing my workplace, right, became anti-fascist work the minute I wanted to defend my community. And I do know that with Solaria Key's case, right, she ends up in training in Harlem in part because Jim Crow kept her from training other places, right? So she has this long arc already of navigating around the Jim Crow regime in a kind of more and it's more kind of insidious way that it operated beyond the South. She is very involved in Hands Off Ethiopia, and I think it's important that, right, to know that she's going to those demonstrations, she's maybe going to those meetings, hearing the pamphleteers on the street, but I think sort of understanding that it's sort of this relationship between a building a life in the teeth of Jim Crow, then finding a place to do what you are good at and what you love in the context of an explicitly anti-fascist space is a kind of exciting way to think about how we might name her anti-fascist politics. And I think that's the case for a lot of the people we talk about is, I think maybe they're not like from the beginning, I'm an anti-fascist, but anti-fascism as a politics is one I think people come into when they find themselves in alignment with or arriving in a larger struggle than the one they were involved in before.
Thank you, Anna. I think for those of you who are not so familiar with Solaria Key, one of the challenges of anybody working on Solaria Key's story, that she herself rewrote her biography to some extent later in oral histories to kind of obscure her own youthful radicalism, and that makes for a complicated source material to work with because there's contradictory versions of the story by Solaria herself. Bill, Janelle, or Ariel, anything else on Solaria Key that you have encountered?
I just want to make a quick plug. I'm sorry to Solaria, but I just want to give a quick plug to her Cuban sister, Rosa Pastora Leclerc, because Solaria is well known as she should be, but Rosa is not. And Rosa Pastora Leclerc was a Black Cuban woman, a feminist, a leftist, and the headmistress of the Cuban school that the people of Cuba founded in the Catalan town of Sitges to house orphans and displaced children of the Republic. So I hope Solaria will forgive me, but I just wanted to, I didn't get a chance to talk about Rosa in my presentation. Her name is Rosa Pastora Leclerc. And she was a Black Cuban woman who served in Spain in an educational and child care setting that really I have not seen discussed almost anywhere. So I just wanted to make a quick plug for her.
Thank you, Ariel. Perfect. Dennis.
Oh, thank you, Sebastian. Thank you again. Thank you for that answer on Solaria. I guess we can do probably one more, then I think we'd have to wrap this up. Sorry, I'm just looking through the chat here. Seeing a lot of them have already been answered. Yeah, I think we can go to Sydney Williams. I believe you just asked a question sort of more in general terms. If you'd like to ask your question, you can do so now.
Hi, thank you. My question is, do you agree that racism is more pervasive than fascism? It's been my observance that people can say, I'm against fascists, but it's like a nice way of getting around saying those people are really racist. For some reason, in our American lexicon, being a racist is verboten, and I don't know why fascism would be any more accepted. But it just seems like the initial reaction from people is to be racist, and then fascism comes in. That's just my question. I wonder what people think.
Big question to end on. So that's perfect.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question to end on because in many ways it helps bring together the discussion that we're having, and that for many of the folks that we talked about, they understood the Black experience, right? One of just stark racism to be reminiscent of fascism as it was unfolding in Europe and colonialism as it was unfolding in Africa and across the global South. And so I think that's part of what the argument that we're making is that you don't have fascism without anti-Black racism, right? Like these things are linked and they're part and parcel, right? I think with regards to your point around folks are more, I don't want to say more racist or racism is more pervasive than fascism. I think part of that has to do with how the United States has engaged in a retelling of World War I and World War II history and where fascism gets to lie, right? For much of how we learn about fascism in this country is that fascism is over there, it's dead and gone, it has absolutely nothing to do with what we've done here. And much of the histories that we've talked about, it muddies that up quite a bit, right? In that folks were always drawing parallels and connections. Folks were always engaged in anti-fascist struggles, right? And there was always this discussion of race, class, ethnicity alongside with fascism, right? So is racism more pervasive than fascism? I think that has more to do with the tool, fascism as a tool, right? And that it is loaded with these many elements, many elements, right? Fascism is sexist, it's anti-democratic, it's all these different things, right? And so the racism is embedded in there, but sometimes the racism is more blatant than other times. And I think it certainly has to do with that, the fact that fascism has genocidal and ethnic cleansing and all kinds of racist elements in there. And those things obviously emit very visceral reactions, right? But I don't think it's more pervasive. I think it's part and parcel of fascism. But great question.
A great answer, Janelle. Does anybody want to add to that?
I think one of the points that Janelle and I are interested in is you can't have a conversation about fascism in America unless you actually talk with some honesty about racism in America. And that's really the point of the Black anti-fascist tradition and the point of the We Charge Genocide petition, which basically was simply a historical chronicle of violence against Black bodies. And it's a prequel to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think there's a kind of American exceptionalism about the inability of fascism to take root here. And our book simply argues that that's a really naive, literally a whitewashing perspective, because the US has had, if not full-blown fascism, many small-scale iterations of it, and we have it today, right? We know, we talk in the end of our book about how before the January 6th rebellion, those same goons were burning Black Lives Matter signs in Washington just 2 weeks before the January 6th rebellion. So I think we want to get at your question in a really serious way. What is the relationship, particularly in the American context, between racism and fascism?
Thank you, Bill. Maybe this is a good point to wrap this up. We're 5 minutes past the hour. Thank you for your patience in the face of the disruptions that we've had here. And thank you to the panelists for your beautiful and powerful contributions. I want to close with just a couple of household type announcements. On April 14th, the anniversary of the Second Spanish Republic, we'll be hosting a musical performance at the ALBA office on West 14th Street. Please visit the alba-valve.org event calendar for more details. Tickets are on sale right now already. We'd love to welcome you there on April 14th. Look for contributions and interviews with the panelists, with Anna, Bill, Janelle, and Ariel in forthcoming issues of The Volunteer, our quarterly magazine. And finally, just a reminder that events like these and the magazine and everything that we do in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives is only possible because of your generous support. Any donation is tax deductible. So if you feel so inclined, we thank you so much for supporting the work that we do in events like these in our magazine, working with teachers, working with students, and trying to keep alive this amazing legacy of American anti-fascism. Thank you so much for being here. It was great to see you all, and hope to see you very soon at our next event. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ariel. And thanks, Janelle, for your beautiful contributions. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.